Dr. Jackie Cilliers writes in an opinion piece about the BRICS Plus, the future of the US dollar and the Western-led global order as we know it. As head of African Futures and Innovation with the Institute for Security Studies, he raises two key questions: a possible shift away from dollar dependence and threatening the global dominance of Washington and its allies. Dr. Cilliers joins us now to expand further on this opinion piece. Dr. Jackie, appreciate your time this evening. Suppose let's start off with that $1 million question. What is that process around de-dollarization, as it's been called? Is it practical? How soon is it likely to happen?
Good evening. No, de-dollarization will be a process that will take, I would say, several decades. The dollar is based on the largest single economy, which is considered to be stable. So what is going to happen is that regions, blocks that don't have a single bank, a single trading arrangement cannot really de-dollarize. What they can do is they can make arrangements with one another, let's say Russia with India, to trade in rupees or in the Russian currency. So it's complicated and it will take time. What is important about BRICS is that the inclusion of countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE means that going forward, petrol or oil and gas will not be paid for in US dollars. And that, I think, was a bit of a surprise to many analysts, and that will certainly reduce the extent to which the rest of the world trades in the dollar. But the essential problem is that you need a single common trading bloc if you want to, like the European Union, if you really want to establish a common currency. The reality going forward is going to be a complicated system of bilateral and trilateral arrangements between countries to trade in their currencies.
Now, the one thing that has been talked about is the threat to global trade, or certainly trade with the West. Is this what this new move is likely to do? On the one side, I think the best way to describe what has happened is there's a growing sense of frustration about the lack of global governance reform within the UN, within the IMF, the World Bank, and all of these. And that is, in a sense, this comes from the non-aligned movement. It goes back decades. But that sense has been intensifying in recent years. So I think that what BRICS represents, it sort of represents a sense of unhappiness, upsurge of frustration with the lack of reform, global governance reform, including with the international financial institutions, and of course the extent to which the West has used its power and influence to, in a sense, punish developing countries. What is important to recognize is that the global dominance of the dollar is inherently not good. Take a country like South Africa, if the interest rates in the US goes up, the rand goes down. We have nothing to do with the decision by the Federal Reserve Bank to raise interest rates, yet we are punished by this. Not willfully so, but the South African rand experiences a negative effect. So reducing the power of the dollar, I think, is a global good. But it is such a strong source of refuse that countries retreat into the US dollar to defend their own currencies, that it will take a long, long time. But it has to start. And it is, I think, important that we shift away from a currency that depends on national decisions within the United States that has an impact then on other countries. So, Dr. Jackie, the BRICS has been around for some time, but it seems that the world is starting to take notice now, particularly with the announcement that 6 more member states will be joining from the 1st of January 2024. And with that, it's almost half the world's population, at least a significant part of the world's population that will fall under this BRICS Plus. And obviously the amount of buying power for those countries is incredibly huge.
Yes, I think that the BRICS Plus, as we now refer to it, certainly has a large component of the world's population, a large component of the world economy. But so what I wrote in my piece is, on the one side, that while we often speak of the G7 as consisting of the United States and a variety of other countries,
The so-called West is a much larger grouping. Let's just say that it includes North America, Canada and the US, the whole European Union, countries like, which is 27 members, countries like Japan and South Korea. And that block of rich democratic countries have a much higher GDP per capita, much higher income levels, and is collectively a much larger economic grouping than even the BRICS. So in the article, we do long-term forecasting. I looked at what point the collective, even an expanded BRICS Plus would be able to, in economic size, be able to be larger than the West, the other grouping and that's going to take several decades. So although BRICS represents eventually an expanding population, the global south, economies are growing, you mustn't underestimate the size of the so-called West. And the difference, of course, is that the West has got a sense of shared values. Democracy, open economic system, and so on. The BRICS grouping is a grouping of very disparate countries. They share a common frustration about the dominance of the West economically and the lack of reform in the global financial and other institutions. But it's a combination of countries that have widely different governance systems. China is an autocracy. Well, Russia you can call a criminal network if you want to. There are established democracies like South Africa, and also large internal differences between countries, or competition between a country like India and a country like China, who are competitors in Asia. So BRICS reflects an unhappiness and a desire to change things. But that is a long way away from establishing a common bank, a common currency, and so on. So it will challenge the West, no doubt, and slowly but surely bring greater balance, I think, to the global system. But it's not, it doesn't have the same ideological coherence that you would speak of when you speak of the so-called West.
So, Dr. Jackie, you talk about a desire. And I think in that desire, there might also be a desperation of sorts. And we're seeing it with what's happening certainly in West Africa, where there seems to be a pushback by many of the former Francophone colonies, colonized countries, if you will. And I sort of get the impression that for BRICS, for countries like China, countries like Brazil that have large economies, the introduction of the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, that they have a lot of muscle and potentially a lot to prove. Do you not get the sense that this in itself, despite the differences from the various member countries, will allow a greater and faster shift to a common goal?
I think it's very difficult. You know, when you establish a common monetary area or economic area, typically the countries are geographically form, a particular region. And BRICS is very disparate. And as I've said, it includes, countries from all over the world. I see BRICS largely as a pressure group. It reflects a deep unhappiness about a world that is still governed by institutions, the UN Security Council, the World Bank, the IMF, that were created in 1945 and 1946 after a war which the West won against Nazi Germany and Japan, which is a completely different world to where we are today. And I think you are right when you make the point about what's happening in Francophone West Africa. There is, I think, and what BRICS is doing, it's tapping into this deep wellness of unhappiness about this global system that apparently is being run by a bunch of countries that were victorious, if you think of the countries on the UN Security Council, in a war that ended in 1946. It no longer holds. At that point, there were 5 members of Africa on the in the UN General Assembly. Today, there are 55. So the world has changed, but the global financial system, the management system, the architecture has not changed. We need a world that also provides opportunity for Africa and for developing countries elsewhere to grow, not a world that is dependent upon the US dollar to trade in oil or whichever, which doesn't pass through the US, but the US, through its extraordinary economic financial muscle, not controls, that's overstating the point, but has an inordinate impact upon the rest of us. So things have to change, and I think what BRICS, the way I look at it, is BRICS presents a significant challenge, and it reflects the need, the desire, the deep-felt desire that reform needs to happen.
Dr. Jackie, I was speaking to a European Union ambassador earlier, and she says to me, we are monitoring, or we are watching the situation that's unfolding around BRICS Plus. Now, how might Western powers react to the growth and influence of BRICS and the potential threat it poses to their global dominance? Because that's exactly what it's doing. It's threatening their dominance.
So I think that we need to nuance this debate. I've referred to it, in a sense, in the same context that you're referring to it now, as reflecting a common desire. But it is such a disparate group that one must be careful of giving it a particular anti-Western flavor, although I think there is a lot to that. We are looking for a world that is more balanced. You cannot argue that today's world that is reflected in the dominance of the US dollar, that in any way objectively makes sense. It doesn't. If we trade with China or we buy oil from Angola, why do we have to buy that in dollars? It makes no sense. So I think that, but of course, the dollar provides a degree of standardization, a common reference point. It simplifies things, but I think the world today is quite a complex situation, and finding an alternative to the US dollar is going to be quite difficult. So the messaging to your your ambassador from Europe and others, I think, needs to reflect upon the changes that are happening. And that, like Europe, which is sort of somehow, to a degree, straddles the US on the one side and China on the other side, and is often more of a responsible player globally, I think they acknowledge some of these challenges, but I think that's what the argument needs to be about. It needs to be about the need for reform, the need for a more balanced global architecture. I think the issue where the debate is going to be most problematic is around, of course, the inclusion of Iran, which is under international sanctions and which has got an abysmal record of how it treats particularly women. And this issue of the extent of which a number of non-democracies and authoritarian states, including China, are members of BRICS is we have to be careful that they do not set the agenda for BRICS. So when you look at the statement that came out of the Johannesburg BRICS summit, the first part of that statement is all about democracy, human rights, the importance of the UN system. And one wonders how countries like Iran, even China and others, we must take those statements seriously. Because the difference between BRICS countries and Western countries is that BRICS countries are concerned about the relations, they judge other countries on the relations between countries, whereas Western countries in actual fact judge countries on how they treat their citizens, the essence of democracy and human rights, although there is a great degree of hypocrisy, of course, in the application of that, but so is there within the BRICS countries. And the world is changing. We need to find a framework that provides space for both kind of approaches, and a space that provides room for developing countries to have an equal share in the future of the world, an equal say in designing the rules that determine the future of the world.
Dr. Jackie, appreciate your time this evening. Dr. Jackie Cilliers, Head of African Futures and Innovation with the Institute for Security Studies.